20 million barrels of oil used to cross these waters every single day. That is roughly 1 in every 5 barrels consumed on the planet, flowing through a corridor barely 50 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. On Tuesday, March 17th, the United States dropped some of the heaviest conventional bombs in its arsenal on the Iranian coastline that overlooks this corridor, attempting to crack open a passage that Iran sealed shut more than 2 weeks ago. The weapons were 5,000-pound deep penetration munitions, designed to bore through layers of rock and reinforced concrete before detonating inside hardened bunkers. The target? Fortified anti-ship missile sites that, according to U.S. Central Command, posed a direct threat to any vessel attempting to navigate the Strait of Hormuz. It was the clearest signal yet that Washington is prepared to use overwhelming force to reopen the world's most important energy choke point, even as virtually every ally it asked for help told it, in one language or another, no. U.S. Central Command announced late on Tuesday that American forces had successfully employed multiple GBU-72 advanced 5,000-pound penetrator munitions against hardened Iranian missile installations along Iran's coastline near the Strait of Hormuz. According to CENTCOM, the Iranian anti-ship cruise missiles housed in those positions represented a direct risk to international shipping in the strait. According to CNN, a U.S. official confirmed the munitions were the GBU-72, a relatively new addition to the Air Force arsenal first released by American aircraft in 2021, specifically developed to overcome deeply buried and hardened targets. According to the maritime executive, the use of these smaller bunker busters, rather than the 30,000-pound GBU-57, suggests the Pentagon is conserving its scarce inventory of super-heavy munitions for other potential targets. The strikes came on the 18th day of the war launched by the United States and Israel against Iran on February 28, 2026. On the same day, Israel confirmed that airstrikes had killed Ali Larijani, Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, and Gholamreza Soleimani, commander of the Basij paramilitary force, two of the most senior Iranian officials eliminated since the war began. Israel also launched a ground invasion of southern Lebanon targeting Hezbollah, expanding the conflict to yet another front. These developments unfolded against a backdrop of diplomatic isolation for Washington. Hours before the Hormuz strikes, President Donald Trump declared on Truth Social that the United States does not need, nor does it want, the help of NATO allies to reopen the strait. This came after virtually every major American ally, from Germany to Japan to Australia, rejected his demand for a joint naval mission to escort commercial shipping through the waterway. The Strait of Hormuz has been a flashpoint of global tension for decades, but the current crisis has no true precedent in modern history. According to energy analysts, this is the largest disruption to global energy supplies since the 1970s oil crisis, and quite possibly the largest in the history of the global oil market. The roots of the current conflict reach back through layers of history. A joint U.S. and British-backed coup in 1953 toppled Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized the oil industry. That intervention installed the Shah, whose authoritarian rule and alignment with Western interests generated decades of resentment that culminated in the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The ensuing hostage crisis severed diplomatic ties between Washington and Tehran, creating an adversarial relationship that has endured for nearly half a century. The more immediate chain of events accelerated dramatically in early 2026. Massive protests swept Iran in January, described as the largest since the revolution itself, driven by economic hardship and crumbling infrastructure. The Iranian government responded with violent repression. Meanwhile, indirect nuclear negotiations mediated by Oman collapsed in February after, according to the UK House of Commons Library, the mediating Omani foreign minister had indicated significant progress, with Iran willing to make concessions. President Trump, however, reportedly expressed dissatisfaction with the talks. A 12-day air conflict between the US, Israel, and Iran in 2025 had already degraded Iranian defenses and nuclear infrastructure. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated series of strikes targeting military facilities, nuclear sites, and Iranian leadership. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the initial assault, according to multiple reports. Iran's Assembly of Experts subsequently appointed Mojtaba Khamenei, the late leader's son, as the new supreme leader. Iran immediately launched retaliatory strikes against Israel, U.S. military bases across the region, and several Gulf states. And on March 2nd, a senior IRGC official declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, warning that any vessel attempting passage would be targeted. The geopolitical chessboard surrounding the Strait of Hormuz involves a constellation of actors whose interests frequently collide. The United States, under President Trump, has framed the war as necessary to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons and to eliminate what it calls a terrorist regime. Reopening the strait is now a central strategic objective. As long as the Iranian blockade holds and Gulf oil remains trapped, the White House cannot declare victory and move on, even if it wishes to, according to Axios. The administration has spent much of the past week trying, and largely failing, to assemble an international coalition to escort tankers through the strait. CENTCOM Commander Brad Cooper stated on Monday that the U.S. would continue to rapidly deplete Iran's ability to threaten freedom of navigation in and around the Strait of Hormuz. Iran, now under an interim leadership structure following Khamenei's death, views the Hormuz blockade as its most powerful remaining leverage. With its air defenses degraded and senior officials being systematically targeted, the ability to choke the global oil supply remains Iran's most consequential asymmetric weapon. The IRGC has declared it will not allow a single liter of oil through the strait linked to the U.S. or its allies, while selectively permitting passage for certain nations. According to Al Jazeera, Turkey, India, and Saudi Arabia have negotiated limited safe passages for specific vessels, suggesting Iran is using access to the strait as a diplomatic instrument, rewarding countries that distance themselves from the conflict. Israel, which launched the ground invasion of southern Lebanon on March 17, has stated that the war will continue for at least 3 more weeks. Israel's declared objectives include dismantling Iran's nuclear program, degrading its military capabilities, and eliminating Hezbollah's operational capacity in Lebanon. Israeli ambassador to the United Nations Danny Danon told CNN there are alternative leaders in Iran who could open the door to diplomacy, signaling an explicit interest in regime change. European NATO allies, led by Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, have collectively rejected military involvement in the Hormuz mission. Germany's Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul stated plainly that his country would not participate in the conflict. France's President Emmanuel Macron said France is prepared to help secure the strait, but only after the hottest phase of the conflict ends, and explicitly not as part of the current war. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas summarized the European position after a meeting of foreign ministers of the 27 member states. There is no appetite within the bloc for this war. As she told Reuters, Europe does not understand the objectives of the conflict, was not consulted before it began, and is not willing to put its people in harm's way. Gulf states occupy the most uncomfortable position. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait have all suffered Iranian retaliatory strikes, including attacks on energy infrastructure and civilian areas, yet they have denied allowing their territory to be used for offensive operations against Iran. The UAE's diplomatic advisor Anwar Gargash said at the Council on Foreign Relations that Abu Dhabi would be open to contributing to an international initiative to secure the strait, but only as part of a broader multilateral effort. The economic consequences of the Hormuz closure are reverberating across every continent. According to Wikipedia's compilation of market data, Brent crude oil surpassed $100 per barrel on March 8 for the first time in 4 years, and reached a peak of $126 per barrel. By the end of last week, Brent settled around $103 per barrel, according to Al Jazeera, representing a price increase of more than 40% since the war began. The numbers tell a story of global vulnerability. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day normally transit the strait. Alternative pipeline routes, including the Saudi East-West pipeline to Yanbu on the Red Sea and the Abu Dhabi pipeline to Fujairah on the Arabian Sea, can carry only an estimated 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day combined, according to data compiled by multiple analysts. The gap is enormous and unbridgeable in the short term. The damage extends far beyond oil. According to CNBC, roughly 1/3 of global fertilizer trade transits the Strait of Hormuz. Urea prices at the New Orleans hub have surged from $475 per metric ton to $680 per metric ton, threatening North American planting season for soy and corn. Europe receives 12 to 14% of its liquefied natural gas from Qatar through the strait, and Qatar's production has been disrupted by Iranian drone attacks on its facilities. Goldman Sachs economists, according to Axios, modeled a scenario where oil averages $98 per barrel through April, raising their U.S. inflation forecast by 0.8 percentage points and trimming GDP growth. In a more extreme scenario, with oil averaging $110 for 2 months, they see inflation reaching 3.3%. Oxford Economics modeled an even grimmer scenario in which prices average $140 per barrel for 2 months, which they characterize as a breaking point that would push the Eurozone, the United Kingdom, and Japan into economic contraction. The International Energy Agency took the unprecedented step of coordinating a release of 400 million barrels from strategic reserves across member nations. But according to calculations by Al Jazeera, this volume covers barely 20 days of normal Strait traffic and roughly 4 days of total global consumption. Asia faces the most acute exposure. According to CNBC, China receives approximately 40% of its oil imports through Hormuz. India sources around 60% of its oil from the Middle East. Thailand, with net oil imports equivalent to 4.7% of GDP, is one of the most vulnerable economies in the region, according to Nomura analysts cited by CNBC. The question at the center of the strategic debate is straightforward. Can the United States forcibly reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and at what cost? According to the maritime executive, the use of GBU-72 bunker-busting bombs against hardened coastal missile sites addresses an unresolved question that has lingered since the war began. Iran had not yet employed its substantial anti-ship missile inventory at scale, prompting analysts to speculate that it was holding these higher-end munitions in reserve for a more valuable target, such as Western naval vessels. By striking the sites preemptively, CENTCOM aims to eliminate the threat before any escort mission begins. However, the operational challenge remains formidable. According to data compiled by analysts cited in the Wikipedia entry on the crisis, sustainable escort operations would require 7 to 8 destroyers providing air cover to move just 3 to 4 commercial ships per day, and doing so for months would stretch American naval resources considerably. Iran's miniature submarine fleet, GPS jamming capabilities, and the sheer narrowness of the waterway all complicate any military solution. Zaidan Al-Kanani, a Middle East politics lecturer at Georgetown University in Qatar, told Al Jazeera that Trump's rhetoric has shifted from potential compromise to continued hardline positions, which he described as a worrying sign for those hoping for de-escalation. Christian Buger, a professor of international relations at the University of Copenhagen specializing in maritime security, told Al Jazeera that for the shipping industry, it is currently impossible to transit the Strait of Hormuz, and that without stronger signals in the near future, the world is looking at a major shipping crisis that could last weeks, if not months. The diplomatic dimension adds another layer of complexity. According to NPR, Germany's spokesperson explicitly noted that the US and Israel did not consult European allies before launching the war, and that Washington stated at the outset that European assistance was neither necessary nor desired. Former Estonian President Toomas Hendrik Ilves told NBC News that it was, in his words, a bit rich for Trump to now be asking help from countries he had previously insulted through tariffs, threats, and diplomatic confrontations. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kallas drew a connection between the strait closure and Russia's war in Ukraine, noting that elevated oil prices directly benefit Moscow's war chest. This creates a paradoxical situation in which a conflict ostensibly aimed at weakening Iranian threats is simultaneously financing Russia's aggression in Europe. The humanitarian toll demands attention alongside the strategic calculations. The Iranian Health Ministry reports at least 1,444 killed and over 18,500 injured by U.S. and Israeli strikes. The independent human rights organization Hrana documented 3,099 deaths in Iran by March 16, including over 1,300 civilians. Separately, the Kurdish rights organization Henga documented at least 5,300 killed in the first 18 days, including 511 civilians, with the remainder being military personnel. In Lebanon, the health ministry reports at least 880 killed. 13 American service members have died, according to U.S. Central Command. The International Red Cross has stated that Iranian civilians are paying a heavy price. These widely divergent figures underscore the difficulty of obtaining reliable data in an active war zone with restricted media access. The ripple effects of the Hormuz crisis are being felt in virtually every corner of the global economy. In Asia, the impact is most direct. China, the world's largest crude oil importer, receives about a third of its oil via the strait and holds approximately 1 billion barrels in reserve, providing a few months of buffer, according to the Wikipedia compilation. India, Japan, South Korea, Pakistan, and Bangladesh all face severe supply pressures. South Asia is especially vulnerable to disruptions in LNG, with Qatar and the UAE accounting for 99% of Pakistan's LNG imports and over half of India's, according to data from the energy consultancy Kepler cited by CNBC. Iran has sought to leverage this vulnerability, reportedly negotiating with India for the release of seized tankers in exchange for safe passage of Indian-flagged vessels. In Europe, the crisis compounds energy security challenges that have persisted since the Russia-Ukraine war. EU foreign ministers gathered in Brussels this week to discuss the surging oil prices. Multiple European leaders have framed the Hormuz closure as an additional argument for accelerating energy independence, even as they resist being drawn into the military conflict. The shipping industry has been upended. According to Al Jazeera, the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre reports that no more than 5 ships per day have passed through the strait since the war began, compared with a historical average of 138 daily transits. Major shipping firms, including Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, have suspended Middle East routes. Insurance premiums for war risk in the strait have surged, and protection and indemnity coverage was temporarily pulled for specific dates, making transit economically unviable even for those willing to accept the physical risk. Alternative routes through the Cape of Good Hope add weeks to delivery times and substantial costs. According to CNBC, the logistics impact could take 2 to 5 weeks to fully materialize as diverted containers arrive in clusters, causing port congestion and supply chain disruptions. The geopolitical fallout has also deepened the rift between the United States and its traditional alliance network. Trump's explicit linkage of the Hormuz crisis to the future of NATO, and his subsequent declaration that the U.S. needs no one's help, marks a significant moment in transatlantic relations. Spain's defense minister stated that her country would never accept military stopgap measures because the objective must be for the war to end. Germany emphasized that its primary responsibility is toward NATO territory and its own European security. The contrast between American unilateralism and European caution suggests a widening divergence that may outlast this particular conflict. Several developments in the coming days and weeks will determine the trajectory of this crisis. First, the effectiveness of the GBU-72 strikes on Iranian coastal missile sites will become apparent as the U.S. moves toward its stated goal of enabling commercial navigation. Whether Iran retains sufficient capability to threaten tankers through remaining missile batteries, fast attack boats, mines, or drone warfare will determine whether the military approach to reopening the strait can succeed. Second, any announcement by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio about which countries, if any, have joined the Hormuz coalition will clarify the diplomatic picture. Trump has claimed unnamed countries are sending assistance, but no government has publicly confirmed participation. Third, the progress of Israel's ground offensive in southern Lebanon opens a significant new front that could further escalate the regional conflict. Hezbollah's response, and any Iranian support for it, could draw additional resources away from the Hormuz theater. Fourth, oil price movements will be a real-time indicator of market confidence. A sustained period above $110 per barrel would begin triggering the more severe economic scenarios modeled by Goldman Sachs and Oxford Economics, including potential recessions in major importing economies. Fifth, the diplomatic track bears watching. Despite the intensifying military operations, signals of possible negotiation persist. France has proposed a phased approach to reopening the strait once the conflict's intensity subsides. The UAE has expressed willingness to contribute to a multilateral maritime security effort. Whether these tentative openings can survive the current escalation remains to be seen. Finally, Iran's internal political dynamics following the death of the supreme leader and the systematic elimination of senior officials will shape whether the country moves toward further entrenchment or potential negotiation. Israel's ambassador explicitly pointed to alternative leaders in Iran who might pursue a different path, though such a transition amid ongoing bombardment seems difficult to envision. What is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a military operation to clear a shipping lane. It is a test of the entire architecture of global energy security, of the alliances that have underpinned international order for decades, and of the limits of military force in solving economic problems. The United States has the firepower to destroy hardened missile sites, but the question of whether it can sustainably guarantee safe passage for thousands of tankers through a narrow waterway bordered by a nation under bombardment is fundamentally different. Meanwhile, every day the strait remains effectively closed. The cost is measured not only in dollars per barrel, but in fertilizer that does not reach farms, gas that does not heat homes, and economic growth that evaporates before it materializes. the world built its energy infrastructure around the assumption that the Strait of Hormuz would always remain open. That assumption has now been shattered, and what replaces it will shape global economics and geopolitics for years to come.